All right. Everybody hear me in the front and the back and the sides? Take that as a yes. The guy in the farthest back said yes, so that counts. All right, welcome. Hopefully everybody's still awake. I'm not quite, but I'll do my best. My name is Joe Izenman. I work in Tacoma, Washington for a company called GearLab, and welcome to the session on open data for direct public engagement. My colleague Chuck had a session title that was exactly 6 characters long, and one of them was a space, so I wanted to use up all of his words too. No problem, Chuck. UX space IRL. Efficient. All right, so just to be upfront, I'm not going to be diving too much into technical details of execution of open data plans. There's just such drastic variation from agency to agency, big to small, but I want to really dial into principles of good open data practice and good public engagement practice, and mostly how the two can really sort of work hand in hand for the kind of positive experience that isn't traditionally associated with, say, open public meetings at government agencies. So, quick intro on me. I've been at a company called Sitecrafting in Tacoma, which is a small full-service web agency, for about 12 years, web development, database management, systems administration. 2016, I decided to change it up a little bit and started getting a master's in information and data science from UC Berkeley, and then moved into a role as a data scientist at GearLab, which is our independent user research consultancy. Mostly right now I'm working on natural language processing and looking at site structure, site similarity between pages for content governance and search. So that's something I'd be totally excited to talk to people about if I weren't already talking about this. Around the same time that I started getting into data science, I also started really getting into my local civic community, which got me looking at our open data portals and information that was available in the city and the state, starting to build little projects and working with election results and public financial disclosures, and just having fun with open data and feeling more engaged because I was working with open data. And so with that in mind, I want to do a quick run through just general principles of open data before we get into what we want to actually use it for. So what is open government data usually used for? Well, the original stars are basically GIS portals. This is most small government agencies' gateway. And I'll preface by saying I'm mostly working from a local perspective, a city perspective, rather than maybe federal open data or even statewide open data. So this is where my thought process is coming from. But these GIS tools, you have these large enterprise tools that agencies are using already because they're providing an essential service, and they have a way to publish this data publicly, and so it becomes the centerpiece, even though it's ultimately not useful for any other kind of open data. But you still get a natural graphic interface, which is nice for lay people, just work with maps, learn things about their neighborhood. Broadening out from that, open data mostly ends up being about departmental transparency. It's saying either we have to share this by law, there's some piece of information we want to put out there, or we have data, people are kind of interested in data, and we're just going to put it out there. So you get a lot of open data that's really just focused on what they talk about, the 3 Bs in the literature, which is bullets, budgets, and buses. And those first 2 of those are pretty fundamental to this idea of transparency. Everybody, whether they really care or not, they want to know that they could find out what people are spending their money on and what crime is like in their neighborhood. This also ties into being able to reduce your internal disclosure burdens, so the feeling that, well, we wouldn't have to answer so many people's questions if we just put the information out there. And maybe you still have to answer questions, but you at least have a place you can direct people to, or you can even filter it down yourself and spend the time on customer service rather than every time somebody calls in or every time a journalist submits a FOIA request having to say, okay, well, let me dig that out of the file cabinet. You have this place where you can can really reduce the effort you have to put in there. And then more recently, we're seeing a lot of performance dashboards. So there's been the rise of process evaluation, data-driven continuous improvement plans and reporting. And so you start putting together these dashboards with your whatever carefully defined metrics you've decided mean that your city is being successful at X, Y, and Z, and putting out a dashboard, which is great in an open data context because you can provide the data for the people who care about that because they're nerds like me. And you can also provide this high-level visual view where you can always point and say, look, we said we were going to do this, and we said this is how we're going to measure it, and here it is. So back in the olden days of 2007, Tim O'Reilly, who runs O'Reilly Publishing and is familiar to anyone who's ever tried to buy a book about a computer in the last several decades. And he hosted this group called the Open Government Working Group, who came out with their idea of what should be 8 core principles of open government data, which I think form a good starting point. So they wanted the data to be complete, so literally everything. If data existed, and is legally permitted to be shared because it's not private or secret, it should be out there. There's no need for information requests because the data is already online. This is one of those things that's the great goal on the horizon that will never actually happen because it's always going to be a work in progress to get literally everything out there. The data should be primary, so actually from the source and at the highest level of granularity possible. So summary reports on neighborhood crime are not open data. They are nice to do, and even the dashboards are not really open data because primary, you want every single row, everything, and you let the end user decide how to aggregate them. It needs to be timely, so either available in real time if you have the engineering background to actually just pipe the data from where it's generated into wherever you're publishing it, or at least timely enough to be useful. So if you're publishing open data about permitting, it should be out there before the building was already built. It should be published at a time when somebody who's trying to use it will get use out of it as more than a historical record. Needs to be accessible to the widest possible range of users and for the widest possible range of uses. Machine processable, so again, like we're not talking about publishing PDFs, we're talking about CSVs and GeoJSON files and something that an enterprising programmer or even somebody who just wants to paste things into an Excel spreadsheet can do so. Non-discriminatory, so no registrations, no credentials, no need to prove you are X, Y, or Z person in order to access it. There's always going to be a need to have credentials if you have programmatic access, if you're trying to use APIs, trying to save your own views, but there's also a need to have the rawest form of it just be out there for anyone to download. Non-proprietary, the short version of this is just give people CSV files and not Excel spreadsheets, because someday Microsoft is going to just change the format entirely and that file is going to become useless and you're tied into an ecosystem, whereas if you can have a non-proprietary format, you're a lot more equipped to roll with the times. And tying into that, just being license-free, beyond reasonable restrictions for privacy and security, having no restriction on reuse, resharing. If somebody wants to build an application based on your data, great, it's getting used. If somebody just wants to share it, somebody wants to use it to investigate why you are such a jerk, also great. I'm sure none of you are jerks, that's fine. So with that in mind, what makes open data different than just putting information on your website? And so I've grayed out a few things that are plenty important, but they're important for everything. Everything on your website should be timely enough to be useful. Everything on there should be accessible. Everything on there should be non-discriminatory. But what makes open data distinct is that it is complete. It is everything and not just cherry-picked. It is primary. It is the highest level that you can have. It's machine processable, and then the file format issues of being non-proprietary, license-free. If you think about, I mentioned performance dashboards as a great part, but not all of an open data ecosystem. They are derived, so they're not complete, and they're generally not primary, and they focus on specific segments. But what makes them work is that you can link directly back to the data. You can have still this complete repository of data, and then you're using it to provide insight for the people who don't want to dig through it themselves. But you always have that two-layered option. So that's speed run through open data. Now I've got a speed run through direct public engagement before I talk about what the title said the presentation was actually on. Now the letters are the same but smaller. All right, so because language is fluid and engagement can mean about a bazillion different things, I want to talk very specifically about direct public engagement as a thing that I've got capitalized throughout instead of just a random phrase. So if we start from the end and sort of work backwards, engagement in a government context, it's different than in like a social media strategy context, kind of different. So in Facebook, you're talking about engagement as clicks and likes and comments. And here I'm talking about how people personally engage with government process, with policy, with information. So the first big distinguishing thing with engagement is that it is active and it is interactive. So if we go back to the example I literally just told you to ignore of social media engagement, the term engagement is used to distinguish from passive interaction. There are plenty of views and reads and things like that are passive consumption, but then there are the clicks and the likes and actually doing something with or to or about the content. And this conceptually, if not literally, translates pretty well into the government space because you have a lot of passive interaction. Your websites are generally publish this information so people can read it. And release these press releases, release this calendar information. It's put it out there to be read. Whereas engagement, we're talking about a much more two-way process where the public is acting on the information and participating in your local process. This works because you've got items that have a personal benefit and a personal impact. People will engage with your government processes when they see it affecting their lives in a real way. This ends up being kind of the bane of the traditional public open comment meeting is you have people ignoring a policy decision in the abstract. They don't really understand zoning and they don't really understand budgeting. And, oh, this is for the whole city and I don't know, it's just a thing. And then they show up just barking mad when the 5-story mixed-use building goes up in their residential neighborhood and it's casting shadows on the opposite side of the street and it's the worst thing ever because they have to park 3 blocks away now instead of right in front of their restaurant or apartment. And it's because they've taken this abstract thing and, all of a sudden it's real to me. And at that point they also become frustrated because it's too late. You can't just go, well, the permitting is fine with the zoning, but because you yelled about it, we're going to tell them no. It's like, no, the time to change this is when you did the zoning. And so you end up with this need for things to also be ongoing and iterative. You don't want that person to go home and think, well, I can never change anything. They're not going to listen to me. You need a sense of, okay, well, when's the next time the zoning's being updated? Maybe I can't stop this building. Maybe I shouldn't be able to stop this building. But when can I engage in this process myself, recognize that this abstract decision affects me here, and become a part of the process? Because they can also improve the process itself. If the city needs to look at this angry person or these half a dozen angry people and say, we need to make it more upfront that when we make these policy decisions, they are going to affect you in this way down the line, maybe we can get people more involved. So who is people? Who is the public? This is a deliberately broad term. It's not citizen engagement. It's not voter engagement. It's not any specific subset. It's your populace at large, anybody who's being affected by the policies you are enacting. You're not expected to get literally everyone, obviously, but a genuinely representative sample with the idea that you're not You're not trying to get specific interest groups. You're not trying to get subject matter experts. There's value in those. There's a place for those. But these engagement initiatives are really getting people who are fundamentally experts in their own lives and experts about living in your city, your jurisdiction, because they understand the impact of the change. And then direct at the front is meant to distinguish, this is when people are personally and actively engaged in the creation of policy. If you think about having an engaged citizenry, you think about something like voting. Voting is great, voting is wonderful, everybody go vote, but it is not direct. It is representative, at least in most of our systems of government. It's going to be representative. You're picking someone who you feel will represent you, and then they are engaging with making policy. So when you have direct engagement, you have people, participating on committees, providing feedback on specific policy decisions, really interacting, really giving their own personal touch. And so this splits up kind of into two categories of thin and thick participation, where thin participation is things like the online survey, the change.org petition, where it activates people individually. They're giving individual input. You're getting a lot of feedback in large volume. You're succeeding because people feel like they're part of a large volume. They understand that they're one of thousands of people who are doing this thing. They're sharing it on social media. But you are limited in the kinds of feedback that you get because you have to be scalable. Your value is coming from your volume and not from the depth of discussion. Whereas thick participation, you get people in groups, people who feel like they're working together and not just giving their own opinion. You have a much more considered and deliberative feedback, things like participatory budgeting. And you're succeeding through the feeling of that real, I am personally having an impact on other people, not just on providing my input, but we're having a conversation, I'm changing my mind, other people are changing their minds. All of this is done with the goal of either informing the public, so sort of engage to inform, and so this does feel like it's more of the passive form, but it's getting people to interact with your process so that they understand it. They may still be providing valuable input, but the value is in them understanding what's happening. You can use this just to collect data. So this is where the big sort of broad swath surveys will come in, where you want to know as many different people's opinions about as many different things as you can. Generating ideas where you have, the small groups and you have a general problem space and you just want new ideas. You want something besides what the bureaucracy is coming up with. Obtaining feedback on ideas in progress, as well as then generating consensus on complete or near complete ideas. So we have this policy, we think it's right, we want to have this kind of backing of, hey, we told a bunch of people and they all said great, or we have these two competing ideas and we want to kind of coalesce around one or the other. So to go with the list of principles of open data, this is a listing of principles from a group called the Institute for Local Government in California, and it's pretty self-explanatory, and I won't spend too much time on all of them, but it gives a quick idea of what you should be trying for when you're trying to engage, particularly at the local level, because at the local level is where people are most likely to feel like they're having hands-on impact. There's only so much you can do at the state and the federal level besides vote and call and sign petitions. You're not necessarily in a group changing a policy as a member of the public. And so it's inclusive planning, transparency, authentic intent, breadth of participation, informed participation, accessible participation, appropriate process, authentic use of the information, so genuinely feeling like I provided the information and now the government is going to use it, and then providing feedback to participants and evaluating your own process. So with those two quick runs and about 20 minutes in, I'm back basically to the title screen. So looking back at the list we just brought up, if we have this core list of principles for engagement and we have our parallel listing from open data, how can they intertwine? How can open data help define, shape, and drive the execution and action of engagement? And how can our plans for engagement in return derive what we need out of the open data platform? So I want to focus in on a subset of the engagement principles that actually interact with open data, because technology can do a lot, but it can't do anything to replace authenticity in your process. If you don't have authentic intent, if you're not genuinely using the information, if you're not being inclusive, I cannot help you with any open data tools. That's just not a thing. But obviously, transparency is a big deal. It's what open data usually is used to do. It provides a great deal of scalability for breadth of participation. A lot more people, especially in those thin participation initiatives, a lot more people can engage with a process than can show up at a meeting. It's also fundamental to doing real informed participation, like saying, here's as much information as you could possibly need to be activated in this engagement, to do a thing. Like, a lot of people will stay out of participating because they just feel like, oh, well, I'm not an expert. I don't know this stuff, so what does my opinion matter? Online platforms can also be engineered for kind of the maximum available amount of accessibility. Public meeting schedules are done on that, and I can see every past meeting where that specific ordinance was talked about, who talked about it, what the time code is, so that when somebody sees, oh, they're talking about this thing I'm interested in, they can see what's been said, or after someone's attended a meeting, they can follow it as it goes through rather than having to dig into every PDF individually. So it helps, and by documenting your process, you help people figure out, okay, which step in this process could I have, or can I in the future have that personal impact? Because what we end up with is currently, at least in every jurisdiction that I've seen, is a very passive model of open data. It is, you have a bunch of agencies within a jurisdiction. You have a city and you have their police department and you have their economic development board, and everybody is throwing data into their portal. Maybe they have an enterprising person on staff who's really going out to them and saying, hey, seriously, please give me some data, any data. No, not that data, more useful data than that. But even so, it's still just kind of blah, here's some data. And then really without any concern of the people at the top, there are also people like me at the bottom who are going, oh, hey, some data. What can I do with this? Fiddle around, build a little tool, tweet some pictures, tweet some visualizations, and it kind of fades away. So it's a very set it and forget it. There's an open data portal because we should have it. We're publishing data because somebody made us, and that's that. And what I would argue for is you really want something that's more like this, where it's driven by the sort of double arrows in the middle, where everybody is both publishing to and consuming from the open data portal. Agencies are not just spitting out data, but they're pulling data in. Internally, you end up with agencies being able to talk to each other through this. If somebody's already gone to the effort of convincing any given agency that they should feed their data into one system, then you can get around some of the interdepartmental bureaucracy of, well, I don't really feel like talking to that other department, but I already put my data out here so they can just get it and I don't have to deal with that. You also have individuals being able to interact more directly with agencies. And I don't necessarily, although maybe, I don't necessarily mean that individuals are themselves have carte blanche to create new data sets and throw stuff up and be administrators on your system. But being able to comment, have discussions, create their own visualizations, interact with the data in a way that enriches it, creates new metadata, and find stuff that nobody on on the jurisdictional side has even bothered to look for because they don't have the time. And so you get the conversation sort of individual to agency, but it also creates this line of communication at the bottom here, which is where you really start to get interesting innovation. Because these individuals, they might be people, they also might be local tech companies, but it's people sharing their understanding and their insight and being able to collaborate, to innovate without worrying about any of the kind of bureaucracy at the top. So you can take this model and you can apply it both to existing engagement opportunities and new ones. So, with traditional public meetings, like I said, publish the process, make every step of every new ordinance, make it data, and make it interconnected data, more importantly, not just row after row of gibberish, but hey, I can connect this to this to this. And it can help keep people engaged on this ongoing basis. If you're already doing online surveys, I'm just saying share the results. Yeah, you'll probably need, if they're not fully anonymous, you'll need some kind of automated de-identification going on, but in general, make people feel like, hey, other people think the same thing that I think. Other people are participating. I am part of a group, part of a movement. Because remember, the thin participation really succeeds when people feel like, I'm not just one person taking this survey. I am one of many people, and enough of us say this is a thing, and so maybe someone will do something about it. If you have deliberative decision-making processes like a participatory budgeting, like participatory zoning, this is the kind of thing that you really need. People need information up front because you want them making informed decisions. And generally, they want to be making informed decisions. They want to know what they're talking about in order to feel comfortable talking about it. You also have a lot of mobile applications, take a picture of this pothole and send it in, and online 311 tools. And you can link this in, again, with the open data of being able to analyze and explain and what trends were seen, what actions were taken. Give people the feeling that you are doing something because, hey, this many people reported problems, this many problems were solved, it cost this much money, here's why we did this thing instead of that thing. And then public-driven engagement, this is where that bottom row comes in of you're just providing the platform. You're letting people decide for themselves how they want to create value, how they want to provide more information for your processes. So to build on that, if you have a well-built tool, if you have a good data platform, it can be really invaluable for fostering this kind of innovation. Having this public comment, making data a conversation, making your web presence a conversation of, it's not just me vomiting information at you, but you saying, okay, well, here's what I think about this, and here's something that I learned about that. Letting users build their own charts, build their own dashboards. If you're never going to have the time to come up with every insight and to share every insight, but if people either are finding something interesting based on the specific thing they're interested in, or you have local individuals who do have expertise, they can kind of spread this around. They can say, look, I found this trend, I found this interesting thing. And rather than it just being kind of in their own little echo chamber, you put it out so that anyone else who's interested in this data.
Do you mean like making APIs for everything?
Well, I think APIs for everything, but also if the tools can be integrated directly. So having not necessarily anything too advanced, but being able to make a bar chart view, a map view out of your data set as part of your user account on an online tool. It can get technically tricky. Some of the out-of-the-box tools will already do this, but just being able to, or even if they're having to make it locally, have an ability to upload stuff to it. And then having data collection tools built in, so having your survey tools just feed straight in, especially if you can then also let end users with a certain amount of oversight create these kinds of surveys themselves. Like if you have a neighborhood council who says, hey, I want to do this kind of survey locally, can I feed it into the city's open data system? And then again, as I keep harping on, the tight content integration of this platform is the thing that I think is really missing from most of them, because most of them are standalone on different cloud servers somewhere entirely elsewhere. Maybe you can embed charts, but really being tied into your web presence. If you have a website for a special engagement initiative where you're hosting a series of meetings and you had your marketing team put together a fancy name for it and a fancy website, the data should also be there. If people want information, then the information should be tied in there and not just, oh, well, I know this is happening and I know there's data over here, I'm going to go over here. Only some people are going to do that. So how then do you end up actually engaging your community with your data and using your data to drive how they engage with your process? Because it's very much a multi-directional thing where you want to use your data to engage your community, but the way to do that is to make sure that they are engaged with how you created the data. And so sort of a tautological pit of despair here, but how do you engage the community? By engaging the community. If you want to use data to get people more connected to your process, to get people working with you, you have to be engaging them before you're putting out the data. You have to be engaging them to figure out, what do people actually want? So often you see what data is out there is, again, it's what data they had handy. Oh, well, I already have this in a spreadsheet, so I can publish it. Or, okay, I guess I can turn that into a spreadsheet if you're really going to make me. But by doing this targeted user research and really talking to people about, hey, we want you to engage with this thing, what data would make you comfortable doing this? And they won't necessarily know. You won't know what data they want, and they may not be thinking in their mindset. And so having skilled user interviewers who can really walk them through and figure out at a deep level, okay, what information do they want? And now go back and go, okay, what data sets can we create? What do we have that will provide this? So we're seeking input at every step of this process, getting continuous feedback on our data, whether our data is providing people with the value they need. There can also be value in, you have a lot of citizen advisory commissions for planning and transportation. Having a commission on open data and on public engagement, I think would be just a fantastic thing to see in my town specifically. A place where I can go and say, look, I think that we need more of this kind of information, and maybe internally the politics are preventing it, but if we can have this sort of unified voice that says, look, we have some amount of authority to tell you, yes, people will benefit and you will benefit from this. So with all that in mind, with the idea of trying to engage with people, I want to think about this list of key questions, which is, why are we sharing data for a given engagement? Which data is going to be essential to our process? What insights can we provide about the data? Where do we put the data, and who can get the job done? Usually you will end up seeing people starting with item 2, just, okay, well, we're doing a thing, what data should we put out there? This is often because the why is assumed. The why is usually transparency. We are putting out data to be transparent about our decisions, and so now what data should we put out? But if we take a step back and really think about, why really are we putting this out? What are people going to genuinely gain other than simply knowing the information is there? Because engaging with the community means really engage with them at literally every step in a very user-centered way with your public in mind rather than your departments. So why are we sharing the data? Well, we might have an existing engagement that requires a lot of information. We're already doing participatory budgeting, but we want to make sure that people know more about what they're deciding. And so, okay, what information are we then going to need for that process? We may have, again, existing engagements that have dramatic under-engagement, where people are simply not participating because, again, they don't feel informed. Not just because we want them to be informed so they make a good decision, but they need to be informed to feel like they are qualified to make any kind of decision at all. You'll always have some people who always feel qualified to make every decision no matter what, but you'd like the other people to show up too. You also have the potential for new data-driven engagements. We want to come up with data. It can be hard to sort of come up with the data to come up with the new engagement, but you can think about it in both directions. Okay, we want to do something around this. We don't know what data do we have we could share. How can we build an engagement around it? And then again, the public-driven initiatives where just talking to people going, what information do you want to see so you can come up with ideas? It's a very kind of vague thing, but having an ongoing process of user research and just talking to people and saying, what do you wish you knew more about? What do you wish you had a bigger hand in? Now here's the information about that. Now think about what would you do with this information? From there, you can step to which data is going to be essential. And this is where, for one thing, you want to focus on the principles of, get as complete data as you can on this subject, get as primary data as you can, and get as recent data as you can. Because if you're trying to get people to make a decision about right now, you don't want information from last year. This is something I should probably put in much bigger letters than this, but treat your external stakeholders like your internal stakeholders. If you imagine that you are working on some process internally, some decision internally, and you're asking your city council to make a decision, or you're asking your department managers to make a decision, people you consider part of your organization, and they are going to be participating in a discussion, coming out of it with a decision at the end. What level of information would they not just request, but insist upon having in order to make that decision? Are they just going to come in and, okay, some of them will, again, just say, well, I don't need any information. I know everything I need to know. But the good ones are going to say, okay, if you're going to ask me to make this decision, I need these reports and this data and this information. And you're going to give it to them because they are your boss or your boss's boss. But if you can think of the public as also kind of your boss, they are the people who are, their taxes are probably funding you to some degree. They are voting for the council people, and they are the people you are asking to participate in these decisions. They deserve just as much information, and they really require just as much information. And there can be a tendency to go, well, I don't work for them. They can figure it out for themselves. So if you can treat them the same way you would treat your bosses, and you can really do the hard work of understanding what they want, and again, also helping them understand what they want, because if they're not thinking from a super data-driven perspective, it can take some finagling to figure out what it is they need at that raw, complete level, and then what you can give them from it. Which is also where what insights can we provide comes in, because again, your raw data, it's very important to provide it. It is important because you are going to have people like me who really want to dig in, make the chart, do the analysis, but not everybody is. And if you're trying to get this broad concept of the public, you need everyone to be able to interact with it on some way. And so having this sort of project equivalent of a performance dashboard where you're building views into the data, knowing, okay, here's this engagement initiative I am doing, here's what I need people to interact with. If you can provide them with insights, the tough part here is to avoid both the presence and even the appearance of bias. If you tell people, I want you to make a decision about something based on this information, and here's what I've already learned about it, whether you mean to or not, people may see that and go, oh, so this is the decision you want me to make because your trend line is already going this way. And this can be a place where having that publicly driven side is beneficial, because instead of just the city saying, or whoever saying, here is the insight you can get from this data, you let the technically savvy participants provide their own insights. You can remove at least one level of that perception of bias. So then where do we put the data once we figured out what we want to put out there and how we want to show it? It's tricky because dedicated data portals can be incredibly effective. Many of them, especially if you're using existing robust solutions, they're going to have APIs, they're going to have a lot of features. They can be very effective. They can also be incredibly intimidating to somebody who is not a programmer and not a numbers junkie. And so you get to a site that's not designed by anybody who cares about what things look like or what the user experience is. They're designed to give you a spreadsheet on a website that you can make some charts from and download stuff from. And so you really need to think about the target user experience. Is going to your Socrata page actually helping people feel more, or are they feeling less engaged when they go look at it? You do need to ensure that whatever your data's home is, it can handle the volume of the initiative. If you're trying to get 10 people to work on a thing, great, that's easy. If you're trying to get 100,000 people to participate in a survey, you probably need something a little more robust. But all of this, told you I'd keep saying it, integrating tightly with your website, with your engagement initiative. Again, not putting it over here, even though your data portal is great, even if it has the best user experience in the world and it's not messy and it's not gross and it's not intimidating, just by having it over here instead of being part of your marketing materials separates it. It makes it a place where only the people who are digging deep in go. And so if you can have a way where it's part of your web presence, where it's simply everywhere, data is not in the data page, data is a segment of every place where data could possibly be useful. It helps people connect to it more quickly, more easily, and more automatically. They don't feel like they have to go somewhere. So finally, who can get the job done? I've been talking about user research. I've been talking about data wrangling. I've been talking about building applications, processing user input, building charts, and all these kinds of things. So a thing you have to think about is your internal capacity up to the task? I'm sure you've all got wonderful and skilled and dedicated IT teams, and I'm sure they're all already extraordinarily busy doing 20 other things. And if they have to, every time you come up with a new engagement initiative, do all of the data wrangling, research the users, figure out what they need, fight the internal battles. It's not necessarily something that can always get done internally, and so it can lead to going, okay, well, this is a good idea, but we don't have the capacity right now, so we won't really do it right this time. We'll just throw some data up there. Maybe next time. Maybe next time. Maybe next time. And so it ends up becoming valuable to consider external partners for these kinds of things. Obviously, it's in my interest to say, hey, you should hire people and pay them lots of money, because you should hire me and pay me lots of money to help you with your public data stuff. But you can also work in a much more collaborative kind of partnership. There's so much possible value. A big part of why the Obama administration pushed for open data initiatives at the federal level was not just to have transparency, was not just to sort of reduce disclosure burden by putting it out there, but it was to foster innovation. It was to give other people a place where this information already was that they could provide their own value to. So if you can find third parties that will gain benefit other than you just giving them money, maybe give them a little money still, but places that can provide additional data sources and additional data uses beyond what you're publishing and combine them. People that can come up with these innovative applications and engagements, not the same thing that you're doing all the time. And people that can conduct genuinely mutually beneficial research. you end up adding capacity, potentially at reduced cost because they are finding the value elsewhere. This alternative expertise, this alternative perspective, and just new pathways to the public, things besides your traditional channels of, we have these email lists and we have this website and this Twitter account and this is how we connect with people. If you have these outside partnerships, so I'm talking about local tech companies that you can reach out to and say, hey, we have this data and we see that you are trying to build up some kind of project around geolocation. Look at all this GIS data we have that you can use. It's free to use. What we ask from you is that when you learn interesting things, you return it to us. You let us publish, let us have access to your papers. Let us have access to new information and new ways that you're engaging with the community. University researchers, social science researchers, and all manner of people will want to have the opportunity to participate in new and interesting ways to engage with your community. People are studying this stuff, and if you've got a poli-sci department or any kind of social science department at a local university, somebody wants to do a project on some new idea that they've read about of how to get the public involved. And so if they're willing to kind of do the legwork of the research of what data is needed, and you can provide the technical backing for them, you end up, again, with this mutually beneficial. You're learning from their results. You are getting things built simply because they need them, and they may have, again, outside sources of funding. People like me, the people who are just civic technology nerds outside of their work environment, they're just sitting, plugging away at data because it's fun and because that's how they personally engage with your process. Having these people not just tweeting on the side about the stuff, but, talk to them, say, hey, we want to post the little app that you made on our Facebook page, and then we want to sit down with you and we want to talk about what would get you to keep doing this. What data are you interested in that we don't have? How can you engage not just with the civic technology people, but, civic communities in general? We've got a local social studies teacher who puts on adult civics happy hours and is always looking for being able to just have information to put up so that everybody talking is informed about the topic. And so being able to say, hey, what information do you want? What, a couple charts can we give you that then can make your conversation more beneficial? And then we gain value because we have a bunch of people who understand our process and our data better. You gain value because you're able to have an engaging conversation. So by working with these people, you can really, I feel like there's a lot of room for benefit, and there's a lot of room for cheaper benefit than you'll necessarily see by just putting that money into your tech budget and hoping that they'll come up with the right answers. So reaching the end just about, I do want to just cover a few major takeaways because I feel like I've kind of journeyed all over the map here. You really want to understand your public, and you want to help them understand their own needs. This comes back to, skillful user research, user interviews. You want to know what data will get them engaged, but again, they may not know. They may need to be walked through the process and really understand their own needs and what will help them feel better. Make your data platform a place for conversation, a place for not just me saying stuff to you, but you saying stuff back, you talking amongst yourselves, us talking amongst yourselves, really a feedback loop in all directions where everyone is interacting with the data constantly and really in an engaged way. I said earlier I should put this in bigger font, so I did. Treat your external stakeholders like your internal stakeholders. Understand that if somebody inside your organization would insist on this data, then somebody outside your organization who you're trying to get to make just as important a decision, have just as important a feedback, ought to have that information too. And finally, seek these mutually beneficial partnerships with your local thought leaders, whether it's people in tech, people in academia, people who are just hanging out at the bar talking about government and voting in elections and putting signs in their yards. Make sure that you are gaining benefit from them and they are gaining benefit from you. And that's my last slide. So I continue to be Joe Izenman. I've got a bunch of information here. I've put the slides up and some resources of where I pulled a lot of my information, a couple of papers and books and websites up at the URL there. And if anybody has any questions, I will at least pretend to answer them.